this is the point where the person always turns and says, "Thank you very much for giving the introduction." But Dawn, actually, I think you could have done a lot better. I thought you left out some of the good stuff. So not really, but it is true that I was reluctant to accept the invitation to talk. However, after thinking about the topic quite a bit and looking out, it's fully justified. The title of the talk, and incidentally, by the way, I'm going to try and keep it to 40 minutes, so there's going to be lots of time for not just questions but comments as well. Before I start, because I'll forget at the end, I want to introduce Peter Tomic, who is my researcher and is responsible for all of the wonderful graphics and much of the research that you're going to see today. So it'll be coming up in a minute, I guess. The title of the presentation is Imperfect Storm Warnings. And what I'm talking about is storm warnings, not just for the Canadian system, but for international protection in general for refugees and also other people who are at risk of various forms of harm. So starting with the perfect storm, here's Mr. George Clooney. And I apologize to you, those of you who have not seen the movie Perfect Storm or don't happen to even know Mr. Clooney. That's who he is. And here's what Mr. Clooney is looking at. So this is the perfect storm with this huge wave that's going to completely wipe out him and his fishing boat. And I want to say that fishing is a minor theme in this presentation. We're going to hear more about fishing later. But now having established this metaphor, I want to immediately change metaphors, and what I'd like to do is take you on a little walkabout, a little tour of the world of international protection. And of course, I was thinking about something like this, that we'd all have this merry romp through the world of refugee protection. Unfortunately, my course and your course is going to be a little more arduous than that, and it's probably going to be a little more like this in terms of as we make our way through. And I'd like to start with 3 caveats. I was going to use the word warnings, but I already used that, and I realize this is an academic presentation, so caveats would sound better than warnings. So the first caveat is, guess what? It's not going to be a Julie Andrews type romp. It's not going to be a happy walk at all. And of course, the big clue is storm warnings itself. The second caveat is, hopefully I'm going to take you to a few surprising places, simply because a lot of you are very knowledgeable about the world I'll be describing, so I hope there will be a few small mysteries in it for you or surprises. And the last thing is that it begins in an unforgivable parochial manner. We're going to start not only in Canada, we're going to start with Canada's inland refugee system, which is a very, very narrow part of the world of international protection. So the first comment to be made in regard to Canada's refugee system right now is, euphemistically speaking, it's a mess. And it's going to get worse. I told you this was going to be a happy talk. So we'll take our first detour now that we're underway, and we're going to take a little zip through Canada's Refugee Museum. And I want to remind you, for those of you who don't know or don't remember, that when the Immigration and Refugee Board started in 1989, there was a mess going on then. There was 88,000 claimants in its own backlog, and the Supreme Court of Canada having issued this instruction that now all refugee claims had to be decided with some form of live hearing, so the refugee claimant would have the opportunity to meet the decision maker. And I'd like to say in the beginning, anything talking about Canada's refugee system is a slightly schizophrenic experience. And what I was remembering, and this of course is where I'm really dating myself, when I was a kid I used to have these cards. And I asked a couple of friends what the name of them was. When you look at them one way, you'd see one picture. You turn the picture slightly the other way and it becomes completely different. Some of them actually had ladies in bikinis on the other side. picture on the other. And anyway, it was quite fascinating. In those days, we didn't have much video, so that's all we had with these little cards to look at in two directions. However, that's somewhat the situation when you're talking about Canada's refugee system. If you look at it one way, you see the IRB, which in terms of acceptance rates has an excellent record relative to other countries. You see some of the jurisprudence from the Federal Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada, such as Ward. There are a lot of very, very positive elements to the system. But you just change that card slightly, talking about the same subject, and all of a sudden you find all these ridiculous decisions that are being made, both positive and negative, by patronage appointments like Mr. Galloway there. I'm just joking. In actuality, he was one of the finest members of the board, and he was a non-patronage appointment, and there were lots of them, so I don't want to pretend it's just one way. However, there were certainly problems in terms of bad decisions. Right now, I would say quite xenophobic and constipated immigration bureaucracy that looks for ways to obstruct rather than facilitate immigration and asylum processes. So it is a Jekyll and Hyde experience, to use another metaphor. And the other note in regard to that is that often when you're speaking about Canada's system, it's a very, very relative concept where you're saying, actually, we've got the best acceptance rate. We mess things up in lots of ways, but relative to the other guys, we look pretty good. So in a way, we can say that we're the best of the bad lot. In terms of Canada's Asylum Museum, I'm going to quickly note this. First of all, this is the doctor. We couldn't find Dr. Jekyll, so there's Doogie Howser up there. He represents Dr. Jekyll. Here are some of the positive aspects of Canada's inland system from the beginning. So, broad access to asylum procedures, once again relative to others, but about 99% of claimants actually had access to the entire system. Moderate detention policies, respecting the convention in regard to work authorizations, access to schooling, health care for claimants, social assistance. Relative, again, to other countries, Canada was very, very progressive, and has been very progressive. The quasi-judicial hearing, the notion that the first hearing would actually be a full hearing, contrasted to most of the other countries that had quick, shoddy decisions by various forms of civil servant. Two-member decisions was a major feature, with the notion that with two members hear the case, if there's one positive decision, that was the benefit of the double principle, that it would there defer to the positive decision over the negative. A tribunal that was independent from government policy. It might surprise you to know that many countries, either overtly, such as the United States, or in a more surreptitious manner, that the decision-making defers to government policy rather than basing it solely on the evidence and the law, which Canada has done. And one thing that isn't fully appreciated, the progressive attitude or spirit of many of the people working within the board. A lot of the positive aspects of decision-making. An excellent documentation center that was used throughout the world. Guidelines. Canada's known for its gender guidelines. It was the first country to introduce gender guidelines, which framed ways in which particularly willing claimants could be framed out as a under the UN Convention, but there were other conventions, there were other guidelines as well in terms of victims of torture and children. And there were a great number of people on the board, members of management, that really wanted to do a good job to produce well-reasoned decisions that actually reflected the realities of persecution.